weekly Old Sword Club lesson live stream. Avasti, I'm wearing a tricorn. I'm fully aware that the in the period that this manual is from, tricorns would have been considered quite old-fashioned. Something like, your father wore in his youth, or even like your grandfather thought was fashionable. I think they were still around in the early 1800s. I've seen like Australian colonial depictions of tricorns, but very, very much, not in vogue. But I thought I'd wear one because, one, I think tricorns are cool, and hope that they come back into fashion sometime soon. But for two, we're talking about Cutlass, and people associate Cutlasses with pirates. So I'm not going to milk that for promotional purposes. So hence, yes, I'm wearing a tricorn for at least an amount of this. Anyway, tonight we're looking at Cutlass and pistol. Specifically, the Cutlass and pistol method of one William Pringle Green. And you can find a link to his manual in the description to this. Pringle Green was actually he was a retired officer of the British Navy, although he was actually based in Canada. So yeah, I guess kind of technically also Canadian as well. I don't pretend to understand how like nationalism actually works. But yeah, he basically wrote down a manuscript of all of his thoughts on how to train and prepare and organize a crew specifically for boarding actions, which to my knowledge was never actually published, or at least not published until recently, but it was found. I think it was actually not sure where it was kept, but yeah, basically was found. It sort of has gained a lot of traction within modern Hindu community because it's something of a curiosity. It's kind of it's a bit of an oddity in terms of what it depicts, because it depicts Cutlass and pistol. It's probably the only manual I can think of where it explicitly discusses what fighting with a sword and firearm in your offhand. And something Pringle Green actually says in the manual is that that's quite abnormal in the period. He says the standard doctrine is you take out and fire your pistol, then you put your pistol away and take out your sword and fight with your sword, which he considers woefully ineffective, primarily because he thinks that the pistol, by the time you're in, or to shoot the pistol when the enemy is far enough away for it to be safe to do so, and then give yourself enough time to change weapons, the pistol is too far away for the pistol to actually be in any way accurate. So we're going to cover his method and what he thinks you should do with the pistol, not just in terms of shooting, but also he thought that the pistol could be used as a parrying device, which is just kind of cool in its own right. This is actually one of a very, very small number of 19th century depictions of, I guess what you term two-weapon fighting, or like fighting with a weapon in each hand, as much as throughout the bulk of history, things like spear and shield or sword and shield were very, very common. By the time you get to the 19th century, there's very, very, most fighting is single weapon fighting. Very, very little, weapon in each hand in Europe. Obviously, in the rest of the world, that's not the case. There's plenty of examples from India and Africa and whatnot, and even the Americas, of people fighting with a weapon in each hand. But as far as Europe and the European tradition goes, not so much. Anyway, let's dive in to use a maritime kind of pun. Let's start. We're going to start with Cutlass and take this hat off. I think the novelty is worn off at this point. Actually, so this is a saber. So I don't have a steel Cutlass yet. Although you do want to send some money my way so I can buy more weapons. That would be much appreciated. So I'm going to use this, which is a boffer Cutlass, but it's good because it's big and it appears well on camera. So yeah, as much as if you start coming to the Old Sword Club, we prefer to belt with steel. We do also belt with boffers, and they show up better on film, so I'm going to use that. And also, it's the right length of the weapon. So to start off with, what Pringle Green says is that you need to drill your troops in the use of Cutlass. And he says primarily they're going to learn it by by like just playing single stick or by practicing fighting whilst they're at sea. Basically, the idea being that sailors will get bored, they'll want something to do, and what's more fun than getting out some single sticks and fighting? Like I love it, so I imagine people back in the day would have found it enjoyable. But he says like you need to drill your troops in the most basic of Cutlass movements, just so that they know what they're doing. And it should be remembered that the people he was drilling that would have been drilled in this, the people who have actually been taught this, were not military sailors in the modern sense. They weren't like navies of today. They were essentially civilians who were hired to work on a military vessel. And as much as they came to the job already knowing how to sail and whatnot, they didn't necessarily come to the job knowing how to fight. So what he says is, start with, you get your troops in just a basic L stance. So in our case, what I want you to do, just put your feet in an L with a line between your back heel, front heel, and the toes of your front or your sword side foot. And then extend your arm just above that, and that will give you the center line of the fight, or your arm extended in a straight line above the line of your two heels and your sword side toes. Extended out straight is the center line of the fight. All right, so from here, I just want you to put your hand behind your back. I just wanted you to know where your center line was. And we're going to step till our feet are about 2 foot apart, give or take, and bend our knees to a nice, comfortable bend. A good test of whether or not your knees are bent properly is if you can walk back and forth and move back and forth with minimal without your head bobbing up and down too much. Because if your head is bobbing up and down, it means that you're preparing for your step by squatting, or you're falling forward, in which case you don't have much control. So yeah, comfortable bend, try and keep your head from bobbing. I mean, obviously it bobs a little, mine does, but minimal. All right, from here, Pringle Green says there are 3 guards that you need to teach with the Cutlass. The head guard, so to form this, all I do is I bend my arm at a little above 90 degrees. I hold it out with my upper arm, whatever this muscle is, basically it can be horizontal, it can be upper or lower depending on adjusting your height. I recommend it as about horizontal, give or take. And then your sword arm coming forward just a little bit. The idea is that this is sitting roughly head height in front of my head. I want it probably level. If I'm looking at myself in the mirror, probably, level with the top of my head. Might look a little bit not that because of the angle of the camera, but there we go. So this is the head guard. He then from here says there are another 2 guards that people need to know, which is the left guard, which you form by bringing your forearm down so it's now level with your shoulders, and your sword is sitting in line with the left side of your body if you're right-handed, or the right side of your body if you're left-handed, and you're looking at your opponent over your forearm. That's the left guard, and then there's the right guard, where you just straighten your arm out. So I'm now extended out to here. And yeah, that's the right guard because it defends the right side of your body. And the advantage of these guards is that you can basically move between them just by moving your elbow. You don't need to make bigger or more drastic moves than that. And the idea is that each one defends one of the 3 principal highly likely lines you're going to be attacked on. So the head guard defends the head, the left guard defends the left side, the right guard defends the right side. And the idea behind this is is that you'd be right-handed. That just seems to be an assumption within the period. They don't seem to. It's only really civilian fencing manuals that actually cater for left-handers. There are also manuals of quote-unquote curing, to just be as insulting as possible in the period left-handedness. So yeah, there's a very, very dominant cultural assumption that someone will be right-handed. All right. So the idea is each of these guards defends a particular line, and you can lie in basically any of them. Pringle Green recommends that you lie in the head guard because as far as he's concerned, the most likely attack you're going to have to defend, especially assuming that the enemy crew is also going to be untrained or poorly trained, like you're very unlikely going to need to deal with sword blows from trained opponents. And there's no point, and that takes so long to teach you that you're not going to get it from under it. There's no point taking into account if this is the only drill you've done, is the head blow. So he recommends you lie basically in head guard, and then move between these guards as needed. But you can actually lie in these guards as well. I think particularly lying in the right guard can be quite useful. All right, so I'm going to call out the guards randomly, and what I want you to do is move between them, because a really, really important skill with these guards is to move between them. Pringle Green's a bit vague about how you train this stuff, but I just find this is a very, very intuitive way to do it. So starting in the head guard, right guard, left guard, right guard, head guard, left guard, head guard, right guard, left guard, right guard, left guard, head guard, right guard, head guard, left guard, right guard, and back to head guard, just to finish off. All right, so that's his very, very simple series of Cutlass guards. These are both somewhere that you fight from and also a way of defending. So if if I'm in the head guard and something comes in at my right flank, I just move down to the right guard. If something comes in my left flank, I move down to the left guard. And if I'm in like the right guard, something comes to my head, I go to the head guard. So fairly straightforward. He also has 3 principal cuts, which are, unsurprisingly, the head cut, which is basically, he's a bit vague as to whether this is a vertical down cut, like a cut number 7, or like just a very, very high sort of cut number 1. He's also got the right cut, and he's a bit vague as to whether this is again a diagonal descending cut or a horizontal cut. I find, to be honest, in terms of efficiency of teaching, the most logical thing to do would just be to say, right, do it horizontal or descending, depending on what you find easier. And that way people will learn a viable technique fairly quickly. And the other one, of course, is the left cut, which again might be horizontal, might be descending. He's not particularly clear. Pringle Green's advice is is more general advice about what to teach people, and a lot of he's got some diagrams and stuff, so it's fairly obvious what he's talking about in a lot of cases. But there's some points where you're like, okay, well, we know what that is from other period systems, but it could be one of 2 things. All right, so let's just try those out. So I'll get you to go to the head guard, and from the head guard, I want you to throw a head cut. So head cut. And the way you throw this cut is you just punch forward. You can do he doesn't really talk about footwork. He does mention lunges in other contexts. But for our purposes, I just want you to do like a little lunge. So just basically step forward about a foot width, and then come back. Because I find that's a very, very good intuitive footwork for beginners, but also fairly useful footwork for people a bit more experienced. So you do is you throw, and after you've started to extend, step forward so that your foot hits the ground when you hit your point of impact, and come back. So head cut, head cut, head cut, head cut, and head cut. All right, now let's look at the right cut. So we're just coming from the right and coming back to the head guard. All right, so same deal, punch forward, and I take a small step so that my tip and my foot hit the ground at the same time. But I also want to start my hand moving before I've started my foot moving. And if this means that I'm not swinging at maximum speed, that doesn't really matter. Most of my power is going to come from a body weight transition rather than from accelerating the hand to ballistic speeds. All right, so ready, and right cut, right cut, right cut, right cut, right cut. And you'll notice I'm alternating between descending and horizontal cuts. What I suggest is you try out both and then do the one that you feel most comfortable with after that. Right cut, right cut, and right cut. Right, and now we're going to look at the left cut. So same idea, same kind of notion. I just drop my hand to bring it to this position, punch forward and flip my tip forward with a small step, and then come back to guard. So left cut, left cut, left cut, left cut, left cut, left cut, and left cut. All right, so that's all fairly simple. I've tried bouting with this, and I find it a bit too simple. Like if you know more complicated cutlass methods, they're better to do. But if you want something you can teach to beginners really, really quickly, this is not a bad method. It's got, unless people know how to specifically counter it, it's got some really, really good stuff there. All right, cool. So now we're going to try and bring that all together, and I'm going to call out the names of cuts and guards randomly. But your goal is to focus on transitioning between them as smoothly as possible. In addition, when I get you through a cut, like if I say call, right cut, I want you to wait at the end of the cut before going back to guard. I know we sort of were practicing coming back to guard before, but if you start doing this instinctively, it's not a bad thing. But for this drill, I want you to stop at the end of the cut, just in case you need to change direction. Oh, also I should have mentioned, if you do have a question, chuck it in the comments, and I can't answer it straight away. I probably won't, but I will get to it, and there'll be like a comment record of it, so I'll get to it as soon as I can. All right, so starting in the head guard, which is our basic guard, we're going to start by going to right guard, left cut, head guard, right cut, right guard, right cut, right guard, left cut, head guard, right cut, left guard, right guard, left guard, left cut, right cut, head guard, right guard, left guard, right guard, right cut, left cut, head guard, head cut, head guard, head cut, right guard, head cut, left guard, head cut, right guard, head guard, right cut, head cut, left cut, head guard. All right, so hopefully that wasn't too overwhelming for you. So I'm just going to quickly grab a sip of tea. Again, if you have any questions, chuck them down. And now we're going to look at the next aspect of the system, which is the pistol. So in this case, it's a Nerf gun because I don't have an actual black powder pistol. What Pringle Green says is that the traditional doctrine of the Navy at the time is you take out your pistol, you fire it, you put your pistol back in, usually actually be wearing, he says they're usually wearing a sash or a belt, but you put your pistol back in whatever you're storing it in, you take your sword out, and you fight. The problem with that is it means that you have to fire when your enemy is quite far away, because you need time to change weapons, which, I mean, it's probably a little bit easier when you've got a properly stored pistol and a cutlass in a proper sheath, but still not particularly quick. What Pringle Green says to do instead is troops should practice firing the pistol in their offhand. So they should get used to firing in their left hand, and then and that way they can have their sword already drawn, so they can fire from quite close. In fact, they can fire from basically out of melee distance. So if you came to our workshop on distance and footwork that we did about 2 months ago now, it's been a while, basically, so long as your opponent is not in lunge distance, you're pretty much able to shoot at them with impunity, and there's kind of this element of brinkmanship as to how close you can let them get before discharging your weapon. Once you discharge your weapon, like I have, from there, what Pringle Green says to do is to turn the weapon in the hand. I mean, I find with just the Nerf guns, it's pretty easy, and hold it above, along the line of your forearm. Remember as well with period pistols, they had much longer barrels than this, so the barrel would actually go, it was like somewhere between 12 and 18 inches depending on the model. So it would cover, most, if not all, of your forearm. But you hold it basically in the same position as the head, as you do for the same arm position as you do for the head guard, and you sit it with it above your head. And then he says you also go to the head guard, so you're sitting there basically with the pistol covering your head, and then you've got the sword free to, defend or attack. And the reason he says this is a good idea is because you're, again, you're most likely to take, for someone to have a swing at your head. So if you've got the pistol there, you've basically got a sword free to fight with. Why he doesn't suggest that you have the sword in, a different guard, so that you've got like your closing two lines is, beyond me, but he doesn't. But yeah, he says basically you start with the sword, with the pistol sitting above your head in basically the same position as it would be for a head guard. And then from there, you can throw your attacks. I mean, I would recommend that you practice attacking with the pistol held here. But Pringle Green just he mostly talks about what you should do rather than necessarily how to learn how to do it. And yeah, that's his basic method. The idea being that the firing device will close off a line. I find personally you can also hold it about here, with it sort of just with your hand sitting roughly above your pistol side eye, or with probably some above your pistol side eye, and that stops pretty much anything coming in along this high line quite effectively. Whereas here you're only really dealing with vertical blows. But that's again more kind of a personal thing I've adapted. Oh, and Kirox just made a really. I'm just going to quickly put this on screen. It's really cool. But Kirox said, yeah, service pistol had a belt hook, which is exactly as it sounds. The steel tongue that ran 2/3 length of the gun, over 10 centimeters or 7 to 8 inches. So yeah, so most guns would have hooked into a belt, which is kind of cool, but a tribute. Thank you, Kirox. All right, so yeah, fairly simple kind of just sit in this guard, protect your head, and throw one of 3 cuts, move between 1 of 3 guards. The other thing there are 2 other things Pringle Green says you can do. One is, he says, when you're lunging, this is his main depiction of a lunge, is you can put the pistol up or basically punch the pistol into the line of attack. So if I have an opponent, I've come up, I'm fighting my opponent. I might even not be properly on guard, and I find this actually works a lot better if you've got your pistol low. Like if I've, if I fired my pistol really close, and I'm then turning advancing on someone else, I find this actually works better because that's when people are more likely to take a swing, particularly at my high pistol side, which when you punch up the pistol to the pistol position and throw in a cut pretty much at the same time. So it will look something like this. Or from the front and from the other side, just so you can see what I'm doing with my sword. Yeah. Cool. So the idea is, yeah, we attack and defend in one movement. And the other advantage of this is I can throw with a slightly wider hand. I don't need to cover myself with my sword because I'm covering myself with a pistol, which means I get it's not much, but it's just a little bit of extra space. So if they're a little, which makes it a little bit harder for them to cover themselves with their own attack, which is, I find quite nifty. So what I get you to do is just sit with your pistol at around belly height. Bring your sword to really wherever you can cut a nice descent, like a nice sort of just descent or nice kind of cut one, right cut from. And we're going to practice that on the lunge. And so I throw my cut and lift up. So cut, 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 and cut. Right, so let's now try that, make that a little bit more complicated. Just a little bit extra. A little bit extra difficulty. We're going to throw a left cut, or cut number 2. And the idea being that if I don't need to form opposition against a cut coming or if I don't need to form a position, I need to defend against something coming in over here with my sword because I'm using my pistol, I can come in the other side and actually kind of attack my opponent almost in absence. Right. Cool. I'll just quickly check what this question is. Cool. Thank you. Thank you, Anthony. All right. Cool. So from here, all I do is raise and cut. So try it again. Raise and cut. 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 And you notice as well when I do this, not necessarily, I don't need to bring my sword that high, but I want to keep my sword hand in front of my pistol hand. I don't want this sort of situation where I'm having to navigate around my sword hand, or worse, still cutting it off. I always want my blade and probably my hand as well, although I can get away with having my hands fairly evenly spaced, to be in front of my sword hand, or in front of my pistol hand, sorry. Okay, and cut, cut, and once more flock, cut. All right, cool. So I've got some questions and comments. So from Alex. So I just want to know, is the use of Nerf gun and foam sword due to the high risk of prosecution and it being too difficult and too priced to own actual antique weapons, or for a high level safety? So sure, the reason for the Nerf gun is antique pistols are quite hard to get, and you can get quite convincing props. It wouldn't be things like LARP rubber band guns and stuff, and it probably wouldn't be that difficult to get the people who make those to just make you one without the mechanism as a powering pistol. I just don't. It's literally reasons of economy. This thing cost me $15. Whereas, getting an actual, something that looks authentic and has a barrel the right length is more than that. The reason I'm using a foam sword is, the main thing is actually it shows up a lot better on camera, as opposed to, the steel sword that I have here, which you can still see, but not quite as well. So it's a bit harder to see what I'm doing with it. And the other thing is I have a whole rack of swords up the back and a bunch more sitting in a pile here. And there's a few in my study as well, none of which are cutlasses. As much as I do intend to get a blunt fencing cutlass when I can afford it, I can't afford it yet. So it's mostly reasons of economy, although I am also using the boffer for reasons of visibility, and also because I'm probably going to hit the roof at some point. Not metaphorically, I mean literally whack the roof. All right, cool. So I find in terms of using the pistol or any kind of offhand implement, there are two, you've got the two principal things you see in Pringle Green. You see this in other systems as well. There is idea one, where I just stick this on a line and stick this on a line and basically say to my opponent, you're not attacking me on that line, you're going to have to attack me somewhere else. I find when you're doing it with a pistol or even an offhand dagger, if I can just grab a dagger, an offhand dagger or something like that, there is always the risk that your opponent will try and get clever and have a poke, and actually have a poke at your hand. So I'll just try and stab you. Usually I'm aiming for the elbow, and if you're fencing someone who's doing this, that's actually quite a good thing to do, because it is, if you time it well, is legitimately hard to deal with. In which case, what you need to do is turn your body and throw a counter attack at them. So if I'm here, I'm saying, right, I'm not going to get cut on, I'm not going to get cut on the high pistol side or on the head. You're going to have to take me somewhere else. My opponent, rather than doing what most people would probably do, which is throw an attack to my open, left flank here, to then have to parry and riposte, decides to take a cheeky stab at my elbow. I'd use that opportunity to have a crack at them. So what I do is, because their sword is going to be here-ish, take a slightly lateral step, slightly lateral vault, and throw a cut, and I'm bringing my sword across the line. My hand is going to be in line with the pistol side of my body to cut, just for extra coverage. and I'm trying to, and what I'm hoping to do is hit them while their sword's extended. So bang. That's all one very, very quick aggressive motion. So just to show that. So I'm vaulting, I'm pulling, I'm actually twisting my body back so to get my forearm out of the way, and I'm cutting across the line. I'm trying to do it all as quickly as possible, just to try and catch my opponent off guard, because I think, you know, they thought they were going to be clever and stab me in the elbow, and I cut them in the head. So let's practice that a few times. This is not in Pringle Green, by the way. This is something I've extrapolated, but we're pretty much at the end of Pringle Green system, and I want to kind of pad this out a bit. So throwing in some of my own thoughts. All right. So slip and cut, 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 and slip and cut. And when you're vaulting, you want to keep your toes pointed at the center of your opponent. Basically, where the toes go, the body will follow. And remember as well, because you're twisting and because it's very, very difficult to get really good knee stability with this, it's only going to be a very, very short step. You're not going to be doing like a full explosive lunge across the room. This is a short step for a close range fight with a close range weapon. And slip and cut, slip and cut, slip and cut, and once more for luck, slip and cut. All right, cool. Just check the questions. All right, cool. And of course, the other use that you do see in Pringle Green, you see in other kind of offhand weapon systems is the offhand weapon is held in reserve. This is particularly true of knives with very little hand protection. So I've got something like this, which is just kind of loosely modeled off, you know, survival type knife thing. Like, you know, the hand guard is not so much there to protect your hand from cuts as it is to stop your hand from sliding down the knife in case it gets like stuck in wood you're chopping or something like that. If I keep this extended the way I normally have a dagger extended, or like a parrying dagger extended, I'm going to get hit in the hand. So I keep it in reserve. I feel like I've got my too many weapons all of a sudden. So I keep it in reserve, so it's back by my sword, and then it comes out to parry. Like I'll slap, you know, use it to basically beat away attacks. And that's kind of the other thing Pringle Green suggests you can do with your pistol is, you know, you just have it. He doesn't really say where you meant to start with it. I imagine that it's, you know, held near it would be for firing, and then you turn it over and immediately go to the position as you attack. Which also kind of makes for a good kind of explosive action. So that was kind of the motion we saw before, where you parry an attack in single action. The other thing Pringle Green says to do is if he has a counter bayonet method, which I think is actually probably the most useful kind of sword type fighting tip he has. I mean, if we're being honest, there's not a lot of advice Pringle Green is going to give to someone who's already familiar with fencing with a cutlass or a saber. But his advice is really, really good for beginners. So if you're running like a LARP or a Ren Fair or something, where you want to teach people to sword fight quickly, Pringle Green is really good because you can teach the whole system in half an hour. Whereas if you're an experienced fencer, not so much. But his advice against a bayonet is starting from a headguard position. The person comes in with their bayonet, you just slam down straight to a right guard. Doesn't matter where they're pointing. The only thing you need to do is make sure that you hit them on the way, which might mean that you have to come forward a little bit. And then as you do, you shoot them. So his idea is basically you start in the head guard, the bayonet comes in, you sweep down to knock the bayonet aside to make sure that you're safe, and then you discharge your pistol. And I've heard that like there was an expectation that smoothbore pistols would need to be discharged from that closer range. Don't take what I'm saying about like firing pistols as an authority. I've not done very much shooting in my life, but I've done just enough to know that I'm really bad at it. But apparently there was Anna Kurtz was saying in his lecture a few weeks ago, there's similar advice was given to cavalry, was you meant to ride right up and fire, as opposed to firing from a distance. I suspect the advice is similar here. The expectation is that you parry, so you're in fencing distance, but because their weapon is occupied, you've got time to shoot. You've got time to shoot them, whilst also advancing. So that again, a very similar movement to what we saw earlier. In fact, I've got you to do this a number of times already, with just the added, pulling your trigger. But I do think this is also very, very good advice if you're just doing like sword versus bayonet. Starting in a guard which is low enough that you can drop it really, really quickly, but high enough that you only need to sweep it through one line to catch the weapon. It's really good. I don't like the hanging guard for this purpose because I find that it's just a bit too high. It doesn't quite get down low enough. Someone's going stabbing for your hip. I find the head guard, because it's a little lower, and also having the bent arm makes it a lot quicker to bring the weapon down, a lot more explosive with a beat, is a bit better for this purpose. I also think this guard, like the engaging guard or the low hanging guard, or just the hanging guard, this becomes a hanging guard when this becomes the old hanging guard, works quite well as well, even though it has the advantage that might tempt my opponent to be like, hang on, I can thrust over the top of that, lift their bayonet up, and give me an opening to come in with my own attack. So yeah, similar sort of idea, but in Pringle Green, you start from the head guard and you sweep down. And I find that's a pretty good thing to do against like spear and bayonet generally, is sweep down, be aggressive. So that's like Pringle Green plus my own random thoughts on it. If anyone has any questions or anything they want to know, now is the time. Otherwise, I'm just going to keep talking a little bit because I do have some trivia for tonight to give you time to type any questions. And so there was a question as to where Pringle Green got his idea. Got his idea of having the pistol in the offhand from. Like, basically, sword fighting evolves. Evolves the same way that like any other kind of cultural trend or aesthetic tradition does. Like you can see what's happening building on what came before. And that's why, like, in the 19th century, you don't see very much offhand weapon use in Europe. And the Europeans who do talk about it either get their ideas from Africa, India, where there is two-weapon fighting, or in the case of Alfred Hutton, he gets his ideas from looking back through history and going, oh, that's how they use that weapon. That's how they used a shield. That's how they used an offhand dagger. We can do the same thing now. But with Pringle Green, there's a suggestion that, especially given his age and the time and place he was, got the idea from cudgel play and specifically from the broadsword, or the broadsword system of the Scots Highlanders. Because in Highland broadsword, there are depictions of cudgel play. So if you remember Alexander Verville, who we looked at last year, and I will do a follow-up workshop on at some point, I swear. Verville talks about the guard of the Highlanders, which looks, this looks familiar, doesn't it? And basically, on the offhand, you have basically a piece of wood strapped to the offhand. So you're sitting here like this, using the piece of wood to protect your head, and then just swiping. So yeah, that's, although it's suggested by the time Verville is publishing, and given his age, this is probably something that he learnt about, that had become very rare and fallen out of favor, but he learned about because Verville traveled very extensively. In fact, his influences are not just European. He also includes African stick systems in his, in his list of martial influences. But you also hear, there are also depictions, as something Paul Wagner pointed out, there are also depictions of people doing basically the same thing with a dagger, where they grab a dagger in the offhand and hold it up, which may actually, I suspect is actually a extension of cudgel play. So someone's gone, okay, well, I keep my hand in front of my face in cudgel play, but that hurts, so I'm going to glue, I'm going to strap a board to it so it doesn't hurt. And someone's gone, hey, it would be so useful in a sword fight to, protect my head with my arm, but I'm going to put my dagger in the way so that it doesn't get hurt. And that's where you get these things, depictions of this, or this kind of idea for, amongst the Highlanders, where they hold the dagger high. And according to Paul Wagner, there are actually depictions of Highlanders doing this. So yeah, it's sort of, it might be that Pringle Green had a bit of exposure to what at the time would have been a very old and very much falling out of fashion kind of system of sword fighting that he got some ideas from. But because he doesn't really list his influences, we never know. And I don't really know much about him otherwise. All right, cool. So let's have a look. So Kirok has cheekily suggested, I tend to think of Pringle Green's treatise as a proposed rule to bring order to chaos. He was probably an engineer, probably, or a ship's captain, just trying to keep everything in order. So if you haven't skimmed through it, Pringle Green's work or his manual is really, really cool because the thing he talks about most is actually formation fighting for boarding action. So he says, if you're going to attack, here's how you deploy, your Marines who have musket and bayonet, and here's how your sailors who have cutlass and pistol. If if you're going to attack, here's how you deploy it, and here's how you maneuver them, and this is where you send them. And there's, and he talks about Cutlass, I think, because there's an assumption that the Marines will be using the bayonet, the musket and bayonet they're trained in using. He doesn't really talk about how to bayonet fence, although bayonet fencing was not that common in the period he was writing. I mean, there's some depictions of it, some mention of it, but yeah, bayonets were mostly formation weapons, so who knows? But one thing Pringle Green actually does say is he says that it is typical on British ships that you have only half as many cutlasses as there are crew on the ship. But he also says there's also half as many boarding pikes as there are crew on the ship. And I think the idea being that half the crew will take boarding pikes, half the crew will take cutlasses. And I'm not sure if the Marines are included in that, but they would have musket and bayonet to use anyway. And Pringle Green reckons that there should be as many cutlasses and pistols as there are sailors, which I think is an interesting comment, because his reasoning being that he thinks that boarding pikes and also bayonet and musket, once you get below deck, like once the decks are taken, or once you get into quite crowded formations, become quite useless. So similar sort of situation, I guess, to what we saw in World War I in trench fighting, where the bayonet just gets too choked up to fight with. And so instead you want, a short, choppy sword to chop. And when you look at sort of the knife, some of the sort of big choppy knives are quite popular amongst soldiers in World War I. To see kind of this, a similar sort of thing as in type places people either want short stabby weapons or short choppy weapons or short wacky weapons. I mean, certainly maces and clubs and stuff are quite popular as well. All right, so Olaf has made a comment. There is also a Bray watercolor that shows wood form protection used by armed sailors on land duty. I think this is the actual manual, which frustratingly, unfortunately, I can't actually open the link for. Otherwise, I'd actually show that on screen. But I'll have to see if I can open the link for that. I'm not typing it all in. Cool. Olaf has also gone to say there are a few nice marine exercise manuals describing formations on how to sweep the deck with a bayonet charge. Oh, cool. Well, Olaf, if you can send some of those my way. I've been trying to get multiple manuals on boarding actions because I think for a HEMA convention, as much as I want to do mass combat, we're never going to have as many people at enough people at a HEMA convention to get close to the size of, like, say, a medieval battle or something like that. But we could replicate a boarding action, like, ship's crews, sometimes had less than 100 people, and there probably would have been boarding actions that had less than 100 people. So you could reasonably get groups of people at a HEMA convention, train them in different boarding action methods, and then just have them duke it out, fight it out, which would just be quite fun. BLF, if you can post those, I'm pretty sure you're in our Facebook group, so if you can post those to the Facebook group, or even to the event page, whichever, that would be fantastic if we can send those. Cool. So Kira points out, interesting about the 50% pikes and cutlasses. A phalanx of Saners with pike and cutlass could sweep, the deck. Yeah, well, that was, I mean, that's what Pringle Green basically says, is that you want even your troops with pikes to have both. What I find interesting as well is the time when he's writing is, it's only the British military has only just stopped issuing infantry, including Marines, with hangers, with basically a cutlass. I think there is a slight technical distinction, but I don't know for a fact. But yeah, basically, this was up until like a few decades, like a decade or two before Pringle Green was writing. Most of the Marines on British ships would have had essentially a cutlass that they could use, and so I think I think Pringle Green is also kind of reacting to that. I kind of wonder if part of the motivation to have that division, to say, right, like when the sailors run to the armory and grab whatever they can, they only grab the one weapon. And what that then means is that a sailor knows exactly what they're meant to be doing, whether they're meant to be defending the deck or flanking. Because the troops armed with cutlasses were primarily used for flanking in Pringle Green's descriptions, at least. And so it's more like it's deliberately an organizational thing, so that rather than people running around and trying to do their own thing, they've got like a dedicated role, and they're taught, right, if you get this weapon, you run to here and you run to here and you do this thing, and if you get this other weapon, then you go and do this other thing. I mean, I don't know that for a fact, but just as speculation as to why it's a good idea, it's a good idea to limit the weapons soldiers can get, from the perspective that it makes it very, very easy to coordinate and command troops. So yeah, kind of be an interesting thing. And then you do also have like boarding axes and stuff, although at least in the British Navy, boarding axes were considered a tool that you would use during a boarding action, not a weapon. In the same way, like you see SWAT teams where they have the big like rams that they use to smack open the doors. There's no expectation that you would use that to hit a person with. Or I would hope there's not. That just I can't envisage a situation where you could hit someone with one of those big rams where the person would actually be able to resist. So, but yeah, so there's no that's a tool. Those rams are a tool that are used to breach into a building. And in the British Navy, the idea was basically that the boarding axes were a tool that were used for breaching into enemy ships. So, I mean, there are depictions of them being smacked into the side of wooden vessels and people climbing up. Or alternatively used to cut ropes or cut rigging on the enemy ship, cut grappling hooks on that are attached to your ship. I imagine that'd also be quite useful for smashing in doors, or cutting your way into an enemy ship. If an enemy's barred a door, you could start just basically hacking the door to bits to get in. But yeah, as far as I know, Matt Easton's done a video on this, and according to Matt Easton, British Navy boarding axe is not seen as a weapon. Although interestingly enough, he says that in America, with the American Navy of the same period, like the United States Navy, and also apparently the French Navy, the boarding axe was seen more as, or the idea of using a boarding axe as a weapon was considered more normal, more intuitive. And then I mean, that makes logical sense with the United States, where there is traditions of, there were traditions of tomahawk fighting, at least amongst sort of the frontiers type people, and probably amongst the lower classes. So yeah, I mean, there are there are actual documents where Ranger units are issued with tomahawks or told to use their tomahawks instead of a bayonet, especially if they're given, especially the ones equipped with carbines rather than full-length muskets, which, I don't know if it was official or just, I mean, the logic at the time would have been that a carbine with a bayonet having less reach than a musket with a bayonet would be a distinct disadvantage. So if you've got a carbine, you might as well use something else, or just, I mean, although there are a lot of cases where units who have got carbines or earlier rifles, which were shorter than like a brown bess musket, were just given longer bayonets. They're given like a proper sword bayonet. So yeah, there was, in the United States, there was a tradition of axe fighting, which might have influenced why they would have done it in the Navy. But yeah, we don't know. There's not a lot of strong documentation for this either way. With the French Navy, who knows? I mean, like, there's not, to my knowledge, there's not like a big French tradition of axe fighting, as far as I know. I mean, later in the 19th century, so we're talking, late 19th century and very, very post two different revolutions, the French were very, very aggressively pragmatic about the martial arts. So, very aggressively pragmatic about, okay, well, here's how you fence with a knife. Here's how you use everyday items to defend yourself. What can we learn from jiu-jitsu? What can we learn from English boxing? Like so there might have been a bit of like a precursor to that, where they're like, all right, well, we can use this as a weapon, so we might as well try. But again, I don't know. I'm not like, I am very much speculating here, and I think it's important to be clear when I'm speculating as opposed to something I know from a historical source. Yes, what else? So, and Nick said, it's at least modified a now useless pistol to be a useful blocking weapon. Or it's actually in C-pun, which I don't know if that was intentional or not, but I just love that as a pun. Like, a C weapon is a C-pun. That's just made my night. Thank you, Mick. Yeah, well, like, yeah, and I mean, not only is he modified not only does this make a pistol, that's my pistol, a good kind of defensive weapon, but it also means you can fire a lot closer. And yeah, like I mean, I've heard a lot of people say that in the period, you had, you had like pistols that had to be fired at point blank range. I mean, Anna was talking about that with cavalry, where the idea was that cavalry would ride up and discharge their pistols at point blank range because it was the only way to reliably hit. Although one of the things he actually said about that is that it's deceptive if you shoot the pistols at targets, because like when you're shooting a target with a pistol, with a smoothbore pistol, you can actually shoot accurately to a not unreasonable distance. Still not great, but it's better than those kinds of doctrines would indicate. And yeah, like, I mean, one thing I learned, doing Nerf wars with my kids is as much as I can accurately shoot a Nerf gun across a hallway, it becomes a lot harder to accurately shoot a Nerf gun when you're also needing to be vigilant that someone is shooting back at you and giggling from the other side of the couch. So yeah, I mean, there's probably a bit of that in a firefight you can't shoot anywhere near as accurately as you can calmly shooting on a range. But the other issue is that the powder doesn't necessarily go off immediately. Like, the powder, there is, it can take up to like a second or two to discharge. So you pull trigger and wait, and as much as it's not a terribly long wait, the difference between instantaneous and a second can make a huge difference to your accuracy when shooting a moving target. So being able to shoot a lot closer and be protected is really cool. And I suspect that part of why you see British officers or European officers using sword and pistol right up until the First World War is, and like even with revolvers, is when you're in close, having a sword as a parrying implement that you can then defend with whilst firing your pistol is really useful and effective. And it's interesting. I don't know of a lot of examples of sword and pistol used in like the Napoleonic era, like early 19th century, but in the late 19th century depictions of British officers with a sword in usually their right hand and a pistol on their left are not or are fairly common. Like if you look through swordsmen of the British Empire, you can see quite a few of them. Yeah, so it's sort of, I guess, food for thought. Cool. So Nick wants to also know, would have been a traditional pike or a pike with a hook, like a bill hook style, to assist with boarding? So I might actually, just give me a second. I'll actually try and get some pictures up of these weapons. So I'm not sure if the sound's cut out. Oh, I have a tendency to. Cool. So I'm just going to see if I can share my screen. Right. I've not done this before, so this will be a bit of an adventure. Right. Cool. So now sharing. So this is basically what a boarding pike looks like. Apparently, yeah, there's some modern military people doing that, which is kind of cool. Yeah, but you see these, they're basically a spear. Yeah, they're primarily like, they are nearly always a spear. I mean, there's always like the one example here, which doesn't actually look like, doesn't look historically like it looks like a D&D weapon. That is a boarding, as a boarding pike. But yeah, to give you a sense of what they look like, they're all just like just basically a straight spike. And yeah, they there's like a straight spike, or like just a very standard kind of spearhead, probably a bit broader than some of the, or probably on the broader side, but not really. Probably would have looked very much at home in the medieval battlefield. In terms of length, they get called boarding pikes, I think, because the term spear probably had become less common, but they are very much a spear. I think they're about like 8 or 9 feet long, if I remember correctly. So yeah, I just actually, okay, conveniently I can check that. So yeah, 8 foot long. So to give you a sense of what that is in the context of me, this is my 8 foot long spear. You can see that, I'll hang a little bit to possibly make it worse, but so what this is like, a little bit longer than the length of my arms, because I'm 6'4". But yeah, so yeah, they're not particularly long. They're not particularly long compared to like a pike. You would have seen the age of pike and shot, but yeah, they are falling down in my armory. But they are decent spike, or decent spike and a sticky spike. Cool. So yeah, so question of pikes in limited space filled with cables. Short answer, yes. Long answer, yeah. This is actually a thing Pringle Green talks about, where he says that the boarding pikes and bayonets are only useful when fighting on the decks, when you've got, when you're in a space that is actually probably not that dissimilar to my armory here, the armory in my house, where if I can get back far enough, I can't reach that high. Like, I can't swing this thing. I got asked once to do quarterstaff, and I'm just like, there's no way. I can't even hold the thing properly in here. And when I do like fighting with my friends and family in this area, there are certain weapons and systems we just can't do. Like longsword is really, really hard because you hit the roof far too easily. But I've never noticed a problem with spear, and the reason is when you're fencing with a boarding pike or a bayonet, you want to really keep your boarding pike in basically. You never really want it to go, the head to go above the height of your shoulders or your neck, because as you extend, it's invariably going to go higher. Space to do this. And you're going to thrust over someone's face, so you want to hold it really in this kind of zone, which means that you're fencing with a weapon in a relatively constrained space already, just for good reasons of good technique. And if you start swinging about and are likely to hit things, yeah, you're already fencing badly. You're already doing something you probably, your instructor would make your instructor upset. And obviously you can strike sideways, but again, like when you do that, you reorientate to line the weapon up, so it's still staying kind of this, torso kind of death zone. And so yeah, they use them, but again, once you get below deck, not so useful. 8. So Keurig says, so actually an axe, which you would need to swing, would be less useful below decks. I'm going to grab an axe. So boarding axes are not particularly big. They're kind of the size of, well, actually, fun trivia, fire department axes that you see, started off as boarding axes. And there's actually a lot of examples of fire departments who had antique axes that started their lives as naval boarding axes, and then the fire department were given them for basically the same purposes, just hacking through doors. I suspect, I can swing this thing in here relatively easily. I probably want a bit more lateral space just because of the weight. I need to zero out the weight, but it's not hugely much. I suspect the bigger issue wouldn't necessarily, that would have been an issue if I was like next to a wall trying to fight someone who's moving, or if it was in a crowded space with people around me who I didn't want to hit. Like friendly fire might be a little bit more of an issue with this than it would be with a cutlass, just as when I swing this, I do bring it past the line of my body a bit just to keep it, to basically keep momentum going, because it's easier to just millinate it back than it is to stop it. But yeah, that might. I think it would work fine. I would be more concerned about an uncoordinated person with a cutlass below deck, hitting walls and also friendlies, than I would be with a person who'd practice swinging and keeping the weapon in front of them, or keeping the tool object in front of them, than it would be about, someone who's got a good spatial awareness is going to be lesser, isn't really going to have a problem with using one of these in a confined space. The main reason I think these weren't terribly commonly used as weapons is just, the advantages of an axe over a sword are hitting power and the ability to hook. Compare that to a cutlass. I don't have to worry about hitting power because I'm not fighting enemies in armor. A cutlass has more than enough power to just chop through a person. Cutlasses weighed, in some cases, more than longer sabers. They were, these good they were proper choppy boys. Whereas, I don't need the axe's advantage of extra hitting power. Hooking is nice, but the sword has the advantage. It's much more versatile, so I can just thrust with the thing. If I've done a lot of foil, or if you've got someone who's particularly uncoordinated and you're worried they're going to swing wildly, just get that person thrusting. You're even doing the good old sort of rush and thrust, so just rush and grab and stab. I can do much shorter, quicker movements with this. It's a bit more nimble, but the main advantage is it has hand protection. I can parry a lot better with a cutlass than I can with an axe. And I'm a lot safer covering myself with a cutlass than I am with an axe. So a cutlass is, for the purposes of boarding actions, a cutlass is a better weapon. And they had enough of them available that they didn't have to worry. So I think they probably just, you know, yeah, an axe is very much, you know, an axe is very much a weapon of opportunity. So yeah, Joe puts out here, an axe is small. Yeah, it's, I mean, smaller than a pike. Usually bits, usually shorter than the longest cutlasses, but there's a lot of cutlasses that were quite short. Like they, you know, they are kind of just big knives, you know, big knives with a basket hilt. It's interesting. There's a lecture by a guy named Archibald McGregor where he says I will now tell you about, you know, fighting with two swords, which are, you know, which you're all interested to hear about. Like he acknowledges that everyone there thinks that dual wielding is cool, and he says basically that sword and dagger and two swords are basically the same thing, because what most people who do two sword fighting do is they get what is essentially a cutlass. So it's technically a sword, but it's not. It's still a lot shorter than the broadsword they're using as their main weapon, and they just fence with the two of those. But yeah, cutlasses can be quite short, and I'm not, which, you know, is obviously very, very helpful in a confined space. But, you know, also has, you know, a lot of sidearms, particularly like infantry sidearms in the 18th century, you know, 17th and 18th century, when you get into musket warfare, were quite short, were basically cutlasses, because they can be readied very, very quickly and effectively. So yeah. Yeah. Kirkos says, you know, as against a pike which thrusts and stabs. Yeah, I mean, the confined space, the arc of a swing of an axe is bigger. The problem with the pike, though, is not that it's, the problem with the pike is not that it's, or how it attacks. It's that you need, it's that it's so long that it becomes unwieldy. Like, you know, I mean, I don't know how many times I've like banged something, spooked my dogs when I've been just like taking my spears somewhere. Like you get inside like corridors, and just the length of them becomes cumbersome. Which, I mean, I used to annoy the shit out of people at my university when I was going to Dark Ages reenactment, because I come into lecture theatre with big, you know, with my spears before going to training, and people just be like, and you know, like they were quite cumbersome. Like just moving around with them is difficult on a day-to-day perspective. So I can imagine, like, if you're in, you know, fighting with one in a crowded hallway would be quite difficult, because as soon as the enemy is not directly in front of you, and you don't have a lot of ease of movement, you're like, it's going to get quite difficult. And the other thing to point out is, I'm going to do this with a shorter spear. Get my gay pride spear out. And yeah, in a lot of pike formation stuff, the principal way of turning is you hold the thing bolt upright, because when it's bolt upright, it's not going to snag on anything. And I mean, you can see that even with this, you know, this is not a particularly long, tall spear. It's shorter than me. And even with that, I'm hitting the roof quite readily. And you can imagine if I was in like a, you know, it was in like a confined space. So if you imagine this is like a wall, and I need to come around a corner, like I'm going to start hitting things. If I had to come around like quite a tight corner as well, like when I've in a crowded uni corridor, when I'm trying to not hit anyone, and like people are more than prepared to try and be helpful, moving a spear around is quite annoying. If I'm doing that with people who are actively trying to, one, impede my movement through a place, and two, injure me, like injure and or kill me, it just becomes a nightmare. And so yeah, yeah, so I think it's not so much about the attacking as it is about the running around and just the maneuvering. If that makes sense. And Mick points out you can thrust with an axe, which you can. Certainly with the axe, you can thrust. Like if you imagine this was sharp, basically doing it's more like a push cut with an axe, will chop someone up, but also just thrusting with like this big metally bit. Like if someone's not wearing protective gear, that's really, really going to hurt. Like just whacking them with the top of the thing. Yeah, so no, you can definitely thrust with an axe. If you need. They're not well designed for it. They're not balanced for it in the way that like a sword is. The balance is not great for, like, I wouldn't, a thrust, you wouldn't have like a thrusting axe style, because like you don't, because the weight is so far up the weapon, it's very hard to have fineness of movement. But if you're positioned for it, it's quite good. Basically, axes are like the opposite of rapiers, where a rapier is really, really well balanced and good for thrusting, but you'd only really cut with one when that is definitely the optimum thing to do. Like when your sword's like offline but your opponent's not covered, you can just come straight back online and whack them. Yeah, that with a rapier, that's when you cut. Otherwise, you just don't. An axe is kind of the opposite. You cut with an axe unless thrusting is the optimal thing to do. Like you've bound your opponent's weapon, or you've got you've hooked them, or they've hooked you, and you just follow them back and whack them in the face. So yeah, you can definitely do it. It will do damage. It's very much a secondary action, a secondary attack. It's not like, you wouldn't do it. You wouldn't necessarily thrust with an axe if you could just as easily cut. But at the times when thrusting is better and easy, you can definitely do it with an axe, and it's really devastating. Cool. So, do we have any more questions? I'll just leave it open for questions for a little bit. I'm just going to quickly grab the things I always post at the end of the session. Cool. So yeah, so I'll just so first off, like if you did enjoy this talk, please be aware that we do have some running costs. The service I use for streaming does require a subscription, and also because we're starting physical classes back in soon, we are going to need insurance. So if you could make a donation to PayPal, that would be greatly appreciated. Obviously, I'm committed to creating sort of as much free, high-quality content as I can for the HEMA community. I don't want there to be a position. I don't want people to be in a position where they have to pay when there's not a cost for me. But yeah, if you can donate, that's good, because there are some degree of running costs for both these live streams and the club. So if you can pitch in, that would be greatly appreciated. Cool. Got a comment from Nick as well, which is he does follow the military concept of KISS, which is very workable. This actually happens when people know me for too long, as they start just accidentally making puns. I didn't make that many puns this workshop, although some, particularly when like I've had like a drink or two, they start coming out. But yeah, no, you see that with a lot of military manuals, except for like formation fighting or things like very military specific skills in the period. They tend to be very, very simplistic. And in the 19th century is when you start to see standard military fencing methods arising. Because informing he's not making puns, it's just a mistake. Which, okay, if you insist, Mick. But yeah, no, you do see the standard military manuals and military drills are very, very simple. Just here is simple cuts. But there were certainly more complicated methods taught to recruits by professional fencing masters, and before really during the Napoleonic era and certainly earlier, there was no simplified standard military doctrine. There was just your regiment hired the services of a fencing master to teach the regiment how to fence. And you even had regimental fencing schools. So you'd have the regiment would have a fencing school attached. Interestingly enough, Alfred Hutton, his first publications were books that he wrote because he was the regimental fencing master for the regiment he was serving with in India. And he said that he thought the regimental fencing schools were a very, very good, important thing. So he was going to, keep it going. He was going to have one for his regiment, but he actually put together his first publications as training manuals, primarily for the work he was doing with his regimental fencing school, but he also thought it would be good for other people. Curiously enough, Hutton's version is actually a simplified version of the 1845 infantry sword exercise, which was from the Angelo School. So he has the same cuts and parries, and he uses the same terminology. The only difference is rather than having 3 guards, he just has the 1. So, incidentally Hutton just has the TOSC guard, or the outside guard, whereas the infantry sword exercise the same period, you also have the inside guard and the hanging guard, and it's all bowed over like this and kind of weird. I think basically to keep the body as far away from attack as possible, which also, if you remember what I was saying before about, just being able to bring down the sword on top of the thrusting weapon, the weakness of, I find this old school hanging guard is that you're still coming from quite high, so you can miss or not get enough leverage. Whereas if your body is further away, it gives you a little bit more time to come down. But yeah, Hutton just has the 1, just has the 1 guard, he just has the TOSC guard, but he still has, cuts 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7, and his parries of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. It's otherwise very, very similar, because there's I don't know if it's still an ongoing debate, but there was a big question as to sort of Hutton's lineage. Where Hutton was coming from with his system. And there was some discussion that there are people who suggested that Hutton's method was simplified, dumbed down, or poorly understood Italian saber. But the problem with that is that, one, when we actually look at Hutton's works in the context of British works, it's very, very obvious where he's basically starting with early to mid 19th century Angelo, and then kind of developing from there. Hutton is actually quite open about where he's coming from. Like, he outright says basically what he does is what he learned at the Angelo School when he was young, he trained there from age 12, basically up until he enlisted and shipped off overseas. He then goes, but I've added in bits and pieces from 17th century backswording and modern Italian saber. He says modern, but he means contemporary Italian saber, not or contemporary to him, which is all during the modern period. The modern period starts with the French Revolution, so just basically the Italian saber of his day. Although there's some question as to what Italian saber methods he's actually referring to, because it's not really clear where he's working from, but he is very, very clear that he's working from Italian saber manuals rather than from what he's learnt training with Italian fencers. But yeah, Hutton's very, very clear, but Hutton's also very, very clear about where anything that's not early to mid 19th century Angelo is coming from in cold steel. He's very clear about his influences, even down to the fact that he's very clear that his transition from a back-weighted guard to a mid-weighted guard is because he's is part of, or is influenced from foil fencing, specifically French foil, because Hutton did French foil. Another comment from Nick. So Rick says, but doesn't Hutton actually say some of the most common cuts are 1, 2, and 4? Definitely says 1 and 2 are the most common. The most common cuts I use are 1, 2, and 4. And so I know there's a lot of people, because I've been doing Hutton for so long, there's a lot of people who I think assume that what I do is a one-to-one, is a direct representation of what Hutton advocates, which is not the case for the simple reason I'm not Alfred Hutton. Like, we have vaguely similar facial hair, and that's about it. But yeah, no, I mean, I'd have to have a look. I mean, certainly the cuts I throw the most are 1, 2, and 4, or 1, 2, 4, or probably 1, 2, 7, and 4. Just because those are the ones that tend to work for me. That might be because, like, Hutton is probably the biggest influence on how I fence is Alfred Hutton and his works. Obviously not the sole influence, because there's a bunch of stuff I do that, there's nothing I do that Hutton says not to do, but there's a bunch of stuff I do there's not stuff that Hutton directly advocates. And so I got a lot of ideas from Jules Jacob as well. Some ideas from Alanson Wynne, but Alanson Wynne is a much more kind of basic, rough and ready kind of manual that, and there's not really anything he has that Hutton doesn't. And got some ideas in terms of refining my technique from John Musgrave Wade as well. But yeah, but certainly, like, in terms of cuts, 1, 2, and 4 are really, really common. So if you just come for the cutlassy night and you're confused as to what I'm talking about, so cut 1 is this angle, cut 2 is this angle, and cut 4 is this angle. And yeah, I mean, obviously 1 and 2, because diagonal descending cuts are the most intuitive. And also I get the best coverage off a descending 45-degree cut. If I cut flat, my opponent can hit my flat, knock my sword down, or just come like over the top or underneath. I need to be very precise about my position. If I come vertical, my opponent can come either side and get opposition, and displace my sword and hit me if I'm not careful. But with descending 45-degree cuts, anything that comes down, anything more vertical is going to get displaced sideways. Anything more sideways is going to get displaced vertically. And so, yeah, these are quite good, useful cuts. They're also the most intuitive. Like, most people, if you give them a sword, will cut this way and this way, which is why I think Pringle Green is like, right, the cuts you need, the thing you need to learn is how to do the instinctual cuts properly. So, straight down, because people do that, come straight down, right to left, because that is a very instinctual strike. And so you must well do it properly. And left to right, because that's the other one people tend to do. And then, yeah, rising cuts. I mean, there are whole systems that just don't have rising cuts because they don't think they're useful. I disagree. I like rising cuts. And then horizontal cuts. Are still fairly common, but they're not as useful. They're much more conditional. And same with vertical cuts. Although, like, directly vertical rising cuts are, just not very common, but vertical descending cuts pretty freaking awesome. Yeah, sweet. So, all right, cool. So I'm just going to throw up the donation request button again. So the thing is, after we finish tonight, we are going to jump on Zoom, just because it's easier to chat. I've tried using Discord and other platforms and just found them kind of frustrating, whereas everyone uses Zoom for work now anyway. So I'll just post the link for that. Yeah. All right, so. All right, cool. So I'm just going to get my Zoom ready and warmed up if you want to jump on. Certainly if you mention sources, more than welcome to jump on and share those there. Yeah, other than that, I'm just going to close out by thanking you all for coming. There's not going to be a workshop next week, unfortunately, because I'm going to be working quite late. So I don't know if I'll be home in time for one, but there will be workshops after that. I'm going to be putting a poll up in the group as to what weapon we do next, because we've sort of come to the end of our Sabre course. And as much as if I was doing live lessons, what I would do at this point is just move on to is to start reviewing everything and doing lessons based on what people need. You know, with online lessons and particularly with recorded ones, it's not. I know I feel like that would get, well, it's one quite difficult because I can't see any of you fencing, but the other is it just gets a bit repetitive. And I know I did repeat the Sabre course again this year that I did at the start of last year, but you know, I figure if it's been a year maybe, plus you know my broadcasting technology's gotten a lot better. I kind of just want to erase the shame of those those early sort of grainy, grainy, crackly, barely audible videos by doing the whole thing again. Yeah, cool. All right. Well, anyway, hopefully I will see you all again soon. And yeah, until then, yeah, hopefully you'll join us all soon.